This episode contains graphic depictions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. Hey there, CATLICK fans. BT here. Thanks for tuning into episode 9. It is a doozy, but I think you're going to love it. Hey, have you heard about the merch and apparel at the CATLICK store? Well, if you haven't, you need to check it out. If you're looking for a unique gift idea, I think you'll really like it. You can browse our collection of shirts, prints, and stickers at CATLICK.com. That's CATLICK.com. All right, enjoy the episode. They don't make downtowns much cuter than Thomasville, Georgia. Visitors are greeted by boutiques, coffee shops, and restaurants nestled under tree-lined avenues. The downtown buildings boast ancient brick facades with charming awnings. Many of them were built in the 1880s, so the windows are lined with decorative Victorian brickwork. Thomasville has about 20,000 residents today, and it's pretty far from Atlanta. It's in South Georgia, like South Georgia, basically in Florida. Several things make South Georgia very different from Atlanta. Summers are more hot and humid, for one. They've also got swamps and enormous live oak trees that hang with clusters of Spanish moss. They've actually got a live oak in Thomasville that's been around since 1680. And the history in Thomasville, it runs deep. Most southern towns were built around a river or a railroad. For Thomasville, it was the latter. The Southern Railway laid tracks there in the 1800s, and that transformed Thomasville into a vacation destination. Thomasville was the last stop on the line, and as wealthy Northerners stepped off the train, they were greeted by lots of sun, southern breezes, and the pungent scent of South Georgia pines mixing with the delicate fragrance of roses. They actually call Thomasville the Rose City. Thanks to a perfect climate and lots of TLC, the city is pretty much bursting with hundreds, if not thousands, of rose bushes. The city maintains them, the parks manicure them, and families even grow them in their front yards. Roses. The city of Thomasville has plenty of them. But you know what Poison had to say about roses? They're easy on the eyes and light on the nose. But at the end of the day, they've all got thorns. You're listening to episode 9 of CATLICK, In the Hands of a Demon. This story begins on a dark and stormy night. Writers are taught to avoid worn-out cliches like dark and stormy night, but that's really how it was on the night of September 24th, 1908. We know a lot about the events of that night because newspapers all across Georgia printed all the details about it. I'm going to be serving up lots of facts here, but just know that I'm not making any of this up. These are first-person accounts gleaned from newspaper articles and court documents from back when these events occurred. Let's go. On this Thursday night, Lucille Linton was home alone. She lived by herself in the house her late father had owned. He had passed away just a few months earlier. Lucille was white, about 40, single, and well-heeled. Her last name, Linton, meant something around town. A newspaper in Atlanta would later call her, quote, one of the most prominent ladies of the city of Thomasville. In addition to being well-known, she was rich. Her recently deceased father was a wealthy guy, and she was the heiress to his estate. There was a steady rain coming down outside on this Thursday night when she heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door, and standing before her was a woman she didn't know, an older black lady. She was wearing black stockings, black gloves, and a big blue bonnet. Earlier that day, Lucille had gotten a telegram from her brother-in-law, who lived in Athens, Georgia. The message explained that he was in the nearby town of Moultrie, but had decided to come visit her in Thomasville. Lucille looks past the unexpected guest standing on her porch and sees a horse and buggy parked out front. Without saying a word, the old woman hands Lucille Linton a note. It was a letter from Alice Ritchie. Lucille knew the Ritchies. They lived just a few miles away. But the note had dire news. On his way to come see her, Lucille's brother-in-law was thrown from his horse and badly injured. He'd been taken to the Ritchie home to recover. The letter explained that Miss Ritchie had sent this Negro woman to come pick her up and bring her back to the Ritchie estate so she could be by his side. Lucille told the woman to wait on her as she gathered her things. She went to her back bedroom, and as she packed her bag, she began to grow suspicious of this woman standing on her front porch. Who was she? Why did she seem to be in a rush? Something seemed off. Lucille had been reading a lot of Sherlock Holmes, so perhaps she was just being a bit paranoid. Nevertheless, she removed her jewelry and packed her revolver just to be safe. The two women stepped off the porch and out into the rain, hurrying to the waiting buggy. As they bumped and jostled along the dark country roads, Lucille Linton grew more uneasy. She was in the back of a stranger's buggy in the middle of the night. And then, a left turn, off the main road. The buggy veered onto an even bumpier country road and into a dense pine thicket. This was not the path to the Ritchie farm. Lucille spoke up, but the driver assured her it was best. She noticed the woman was distracted by something in the floor of the vehicle. Every so often, she would sort of lean over and reach for it. She grew more anxious. Finally, she gave in. She asked to be taken home immediately. The woman assured her everything was fine. The Ritchie home was just ahead. But Lucille grew more urgent, now offering to pay the woman to turn back. But the old woman ignored her, hands on the horse's reins, staring straight ahead. As her body filled with both fear and rage, Lucille realizes she has no other choice. She quietly removes the revolver from her bag and slowly raises it towards the old woman. She demands to go home. Before she has time to react, the old woman drops the reins, spins around, and snatches the gun out of Lucille Linton's hand. Lucille lurches to the other side of the carriage. The driver drops the gun and leaps towards the back. Lucille's world goes dark as some kind of fabric is pulled over her head. As she struggles to get away, she feels a gloved hand slide underneath the covering. Fingers tighten around her neck. Lucille jerks violently to the other side of the carriage, letting out a piercing scream. A nearby farmer, DJ Bruton, is also out on this night. He hears Lucille's cry of distress come from the horse and buggy up ahead. He kicks his horse into a gallop. As he approaches the buggy, he sees two people struggling in the back, so he grabs the reins of the horses to slow down the vehicle. As the old woman realizes what is happening, she lets go of Lucille. She swings her legs over the side of the buggy, takes a flying leap, and flees into the woods, tossing the revolver as she goes. Months later, DJ Bruton would testify in court that before the woman disappeared into the darkness, he noticed she moved with an odd gait. Instead of giving chase, he decides to stay back with the now panic-stricken Lucille Linton. He recognizes Lucille. He knows her from around town. She's exasperated and her hair is tousled. He tries to calm her down as he escorts her to safety. On the ride back to his farm, she gives him the play-by-play of what had happened. Once back home, Bruton makes a call, tipping off a neighbor about the attack. Within minutes, a posse is summoned, and a group of local men heads out into the night with lanterns in hand. They begin their hunt at the spot where Bruton stopped the buggy. Several men brought their bloodhounds, and the dogs quickly pick up the scent. They all go racing in the direction the old woman fled. The mustached men race through the soggy South Georgia forest, along old dirt roads and across shallow streams. After about a mile, the howling hounds lead them to a lonely cottage in the woods. It's dark, and as far as they can tell, the shack is abandoned. The dogs lose the scent around the site of an old well, built in the front yard of the house. A couple of men volunteer to go inside and investigate. The house is run down and pretty much empty. It had obviously been abandoned years earlier. But in one room, the men find a large white piece of cloth, almost like a tarp. In another room, they find a small mirror, a lantern, a candle, and a dirty towel soiled by some kind of greasy black substance. But it's the final room that left the most questions. The Atlanta Constitution would later write about this room as described in court proceedings. In the adjoining room on the floor, passing through stationary rings, running from end to end and leading back to the rear side of the building, was a wire. Those wires had been strung along the floor to set off a trap gun when the time came. There was no gun there, and the presence of a gun harnessed to those wires was all that was necessary to send hot lead after someone. The room had pretty much been booby-trapped. The contraption was triggered by a tripwire, which would fire a gun, blasting anyone who came through the front door. Detectives would later note the sophistication of the device. In this same room, someone also had drilled strange holes at random intervals. They appeared to be peepholes. Meanwhile, one of the remaining men outside of the shack got curious about the well. He leans over with his lantern, illuminating the circular stone opening. Several feet below, he sees something. A bundle of fabric wrapped in twine and dangling by a string caught on a nail. He reaches in and pulls it out. Other men gather around as the man unbinds the twine. It's a bundle of women's clothing. He lays out each piece: long skirt, a traditional blouse, gloves, and a bonnet. The men inside reported finding a pair of black stockings, wet and with the feet cut out. The men aren't sure what to make of all this. As the posse regroups, another man emerges from the darkness riding a small gray horse, but he's no stranger. It's William H. Mitchell, though most people around town just call him W.H. Mitchell was one of the most well-respected men in all of Thomasville. About 50 years old, married, with several grown kids, he also was a graduate of the University of Georgia and a successful farmer. He was also quite wealthy, the result of owning lots of land and being the heir to his father's estate. His dad, T.C. Mitchell, was a pillar of Thomasville, and also the builder of the famed Mitchell House, a luxury resort-style hotel that catered to Northerners who wanted to winter in the South during the snowy months. Mitchell tells the men that earlier that evening someone had stolen his horse and buggy, and he'd been out that night patrolling the area and looking for the thieves. Having lost the trail, some of the men called it a night, while a few others head to the designated rendezvous point for the evening, the Vashti House. The Vashti House opened in 1903 as a home for troubled girls in South Georgia. Several ladies at Vashti tended to a frazzled Lucille Linton as she recounted her ordeal. She tells several of the women that night that she has no idea who her abductor was. While at the Vashti House, she also gave specific and stern instructions to DJ Bruton, the farmer who'd come to her aid. He was not to let the horse and buggy of the old woman out of his sight. This was a clue to the identity of her abductor, she told him. Later that night, several members of the posse arrived at the Vashti House. Among them was the latecomer William Mitchell. Months later at trial, Linton would testify that, quote, his face was ashy and gray and his chin trembled, end quote. This observation about Mitchell's appearance might seem insignificant, but it was anything but. While this whole bizarre episode occurred on a rainy Thursday night, it was the next day when Lucille Linton dropped her bombshell. Lucille first made this unbelievable and stunning confession to a friend. Despite what she'd said the night before, she did, in fact, know the identity of her abductor. So who was the old black woman who lured Mitchell into the buggy, drove her deep into a lonely forest on a rainy night, and then tried to choke her? Well, it wasn't a she. She was a he. And he wasn't black. He was white. This person was William H. Mitchell. There wasn't a doubt in her mind that the person on her doorstep that night was one of the most prominent men in Thomasville, painted in blackface and attired in women's clothing. She knew this because she'd known Will Mitchell, as she called him, her whole life, and she was first cousins with Mitchell's wife, Lula. He was a family friend. This was an absolutely breathtaking accusation that a wealthy, prominent white businessman would disguise himself as a black woman to commit a crime like this was utterly unfathomable in 1908. That same day, Linton left town for Athens, Georgia. She would never again be a resident of Thomasville. It would be several days before the papers were alerted to this accusation. Meanwhile, the story gets weirder. 2 nights after the abduction of Lucille Linton, Thomasville police get a phone call saying there'd been a shooting at the farmstead of William H. Mitchell. At this point, they know nothing about Linton's accusation about Mitchell. When the police arrive at Mitchell's farm, they find him wounded and bleeding. He'd been shot in both legs and through one hand. He told police that he was sitting in his library reading when a man appeared in the window and fired several shots. Mitchell returned fire, but the man got away. Being a person of great local prominence, this instigated a manhunt of its own. But the shooter was never found. The week after the shooting, a few South Georgia papers catch wind of Lucille Linton's bold accusation. The paper in Macon, Georgia, is one of the first to report. Reports that reached here from Thomasville today indicate that the outside world has not been given all of the sensational developments in the recent attempt to abduct Ms. Lucille Linton, in the alleged attempt last Saturday night to assassinate W.H. Mitchell of that city. Miss Linton charges a prominent young man with the attempted abduction. She declares that she recognized him before he attempted to throw the lap robe over her head, though he was blacked as a Negro woman. A Pinkerton detective has been at work on the case, and he says all of the evidence points to this man. Miss Linton attributes her escape to the fact that she was in the hands of a demon, and she kept her nerve. In the hands of a demon. Within days, local officials had seen enough, and they arrested William H. Mitchell on suspicion of kidnapping and assaulting Lucille Linton. Newspapers all across the state began reporting about the sensational story of the wealthy South Georgia planter who allegedly donned blackface to abduct one of the local Southern belles of Thomasville. Even in Atlanta, the forthcoming trial of W.H. Mitchell draws widespread attention. Now, this all went down in September and into October. By November, the state is preparing its case against Mitchell and calling dozens of witnesses from all over the state and beyond. Papers begin pumping up the trial, declaring that it's going to be one of the most closely watched trials in state history. The Atlanta Georgian touts Mitchell's reputation. William H. Mitchell is one of 2 sons of the Georgia pioneer of that name, a brother to 5 ladies of prominence socially in South Georgia, a citizen who has from childhood held the respect, confidence, and esteem of all with whom he has come in contact, and a son of the builder of the Mitchell House. The trial kicks off on December the 1st. After weeks of intense investigation, the state prosecutors lay out their case. Here it is. The day before the abduction, W.H. Mitchell traveled to the nearby town of Moultrie, where he sent a fake telegram to Lucille Linton. Using the forged signature of her brother-in-law, Thomas Green, he fabricates a story about Green's surprise trip to Thomasville. Around dusk of the next day, he shows up on Linton's doorstep dressed as an old black woman. He wears black gloves and black stockings on his arms in order to hide his white skin. He presents Linton with another fake document, the letter from Miss Ritchie describing Green's accident and imploring Lucille to ride to the Ritchie estate with the old woman. On the way to the Ritchie farm, Mitchell deviates from the route and diverts through a dark and lonely stretch of forest. His destination? the abandoned booby-trapped cottage in the woods, which, oh yeah, was on his property. This from the Valdosta Times. Considerable evidence was brought out in regard to the little house and its wirings, the object of the state being to show that Miss Linton was to be taken there and kept in confinement. Detectives revealed that Mitchell had brought some kind of hood or blanket in the carriage with him, as well as several straps. They made the case that he intended to use these items to blindfold and bind Ms. Linton. Of course, Mitchell never made it to the abandoned shack because of Linton's quick action and the intervention by the farmer DJ Bruton. Prosecutors said that after Mitchell fled into the woods, he ran to the abandoned house, scrubbed off the blackface, shed his feminine attire, and then threw them in the old well to destroy the evidence. The bundle of clothes would never have been found had they not been caught on a nail near the opening of the well. After this, Mitchell mounts his horse and appears in several places declaring that thieves had stolen his horse and buggy. 2 days later, Mitchell shoots himself but claims that an unknown assailant shot him through his window. The state makes the case that Mitchell did this either to help corroborate his bogus story about being troubled by thieves or simply to gain sympathy from a jury. Prosecutors initially listed 3 possible motives. Number 1, robbery of Lucille Linton's home. Number 2, murder in some out-of-the-way spot. And number 3, criminal assault. Mitchell sat through the court proceedings with his wife by his side. Reporters noted his steely, non-emotional disposition and that he was sporting 2 crutches and a bandaged hand. Mitchell maintained his innocence throughout the trial. He claimed he knew nothing of the abduction and that the real abductor had used his horse and buggy to commit the crime. The wire contraption in the creepy shack? He admitted building it, but it was simply a crude system designed to deter thieves who'd been giving him trouble. Each day during the trial, the courtroom was filled with spectators. Mitchell's team of attorneys brought in a heavy-hitting cast of wealthy and well-known men to speak to Mitchell's good character. One after the other, they raved about Mitchell. He'd been a pillar of this community for decades. His record was spotless. It was inconceivable that this man could concoct such a devilish plan. Despite their best efforts, the prosecution hit back even harder. They presented a devastating case against Mitchell. Here are the highlights. Not 1, but 2 Western Union Telegraph operators from the little town of Moultrie took the stand. They testified that an older white gentleman had come in to send a telegram the day before the abduction. It had been signed as Thomas Green. When asked if that man was in the courtroom, they both answered yes and pointed at William H. Mitchell. Next, 3 different merchants from Thomasville testified that Mitchell had been in their stores purchasing female clothing. One guy sold him the lady's shirt, one sold him the black gloves, and one sold him the stockings. Mitchell had claimed the lady stockings were for his cook. Next, a handwriting expert from Atlanta examined the telegrams and compared them to known samples of Mitchell's handwriting. Though he tried to disguise it, the specialist was convinced that the forged telegrams were written in Mitchell's hand. The state also called to the stand the man who retrieved the bundle of clothes from the old well. He testified that amongst the items discovered that night was a towel bearing the laundry mark of W.H. Mitchell. And finally, it was also noted that Mitchell, who for years had worn a crisp white mustache, had strangely shaved it off several days before the abduction. But that wasn't all. Lucille Linton took the stand, and when shown all the pieces of clothing retrieved from the well, she confirmed that they were the same articles worn by the old woman. She even told the court that the skirt shown actually belonged to Will Mitchell's wife, as she'd seen her wear it before. Linton was subjected to hours of grueling cross-examination, and reporters noted her confident and calm demeanor on the stand. It's interesting to note here that throughout the trial, she never referred to him as William Mitchell, just Will. Linton was resolute in her belief that Mitchell was her abductor. She explained that he broke character during the scuffle in the carriage, which is when she recognized his voice. She also said he was confident handling the revolver and that no woman, quote, handles weapons with such ease and abandon, end quote. Mitchell's lawyers asked her why she left Thomasville the day after the incident. She told them it was because she was afraid of Will Mitchell. They also asked her why, if she was so confident that Mitchell was the one, did she wait a full day to tell anyone that he was the guy? She explained that Will Mitchell was a close family friend and she delayed telling anyone in order to give him time to escape. To escape? When the defense asked her what she meant by that, she said that Mitchell had tried to escape to South America several years before. When they pressed her to elaborate, she declined to say more. The facts presented were a slam dunk for the prosecution. The Valdosta Times said they'd built a, quote, almost insurmountable wall of evidence around Mitchell. There was positively no doubt that William H. Mitchell was guilty. But there was a twist. Towards the end of the trial, newspapers began to spread the rumor that Mitchell's attorneys, in an act of desperation, may plead lunacy. And that's exactly what they did. On December 3rd, they made the case that Mitchell was temporarily insane and that the jury should consider this when making their judgment. Prosecutors put several doctors on the stand. They laid out the actions Mitchell had taken to deceive, abduct, and eventually harm Miss Linton. They then asked if they would consider a person who had done this to be criminally insane. Each of them said yes. On the last day of the trial, closing arguments were made with Judge Roan presiding. FYI, this is the same Judge Roan who years later would preside over several of the Ripper trials. Judge Roan explains to the jury the three possible charges. Number 1, assault. Number 2, assault and battery. And number 3, assault with intent to rape. The jury deliberated for 17 hours. But then, they made their decision. On December the 5th, the Atlanta Georgian reported the verdict. William H. Mitchell was found guilty of assault and battery on Miss Lucille Linton. Punishment of 1 year's imprisonment was imposed. Judge Roan sentenced Mitchell to a year on the chain gang, which was a pretty big deal for a wealthy white man back then. The Georgian noted that it was generally accepted that the jury chosen was one that was fairly friendly to Mitchell's interests. Some of Mitchell's friends told reporters off the record that Mitchell was lucky to get off with such a light sentence. I have to say, I agree with them. This sentence seems crazy soft to me, especially for someone who'd kidnapped a woman and intended to hold her hostage in some kind of creepy torture hut in the woods. The most interesting quote from the sentencing came from Judge Roan. Here's what he said. Again, this is the Georgian quoting him in court that day. Mitchell, I have done my best. I have had no interest in the case other than attendant upon the duties of a judge. If you did this thing, I do not believe it was the William Mitchell I now see. There is another man called Will Mitchell who must have done it. A Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, this is a pretty fascinating statement. This is from Judge Roan. He had sat through all the proceedings, he'd seen all the evidence, and he's basically saying, listen, if you did this, you're kind of crazy. You're Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are two people inside of you. The well-respected, put-together, successful businessman that everybody knows and respects, and the conniving, deviant psychopath who showed up on the porch of Lucille Linton dressed as an old black woman. The day after the sentencing, the Atlanta Constitution ran a big follow-up piece, sort of a trial recap with a few exclusives. Headline: South Georgia mystery baffles investigators. Defendant's queer acts described by neighbor. The lead: Fiction in its most fantastic sway never presented a situation more replete with astonishing, sensational, and mysterious situations than the Mitchell-Linton case. The article declared that virtually all the evidence that came out in trial pointed to Mitchell's guilt. It explained that this was, quote, the work of a man with an unbalanced mind, end quote. The jury, they said, was wholly convinced that Mitchell was insane at the time the crime was committed. The paper also added this interesting observation. It was shown that Mitchell in years gone by had been erratic in many acts, that he had done things a sane, rational mind would never dream of in the most visionary minutes. erratic acts? What exactly did they mean by this? Well, apparently several people did confirm during the trial that Mitchell had mysteriously disappeared and gone to South America, staying there for several years. The paper also interviewed a former Emory University classmate of Mitchell's who said that he was, quote, given to wearing women's apparel, end quote. He'd even been arrested for it once. An ex-Emory professor confirmed this story, saying that, yeah, Mitchell was pretty much known for wearing women's clothing. It was sort of a gag of his. They also tracked down a neighbor of Mitchell's who told a really strange story about some pigs. One time, Mitchell bought 2 hogs that eventually had a litter of pigs. But over time, the pigs got sick. One morning, the neighbor woke up to the sound of gunshots, looks out the window, and sees Mitchell shooting the baby pigs one by one. The article quotes the neighbor as saying this: "He didn't stop until there wasn't a live hog or pig in that pen. He strikes me as a man who acts on an impulse." Strangely, the article also mentions Mitchell's great-grandfather, who'd once owned lots of land and hundreds of slaves in Thomas County. The paper said, quote, "The elder Mitchell was very eccentric, and his behavior on many occasions was odd on the extreme," end quote. Old Man Mitchell apparently died by laudanum and not by an accident, according to the paper. Mitchell avoided the chain gang for several months while his team of lawyers prepared an appeal. By the spring of 1909, Mitchell was back in the headlines as papers around the state covered the hearings from the Georgia Court of Appeals. In these articles, I discovered a previously unreported feature of the creepy shack in the woods. In addition to the tripwire device and peepholes, there was some kind of trap door constructed as well. The state made the case that Mitchell's intent was to detain or cage Miss Linton using this door. Judge Roan had some interesting words about this. Again, this is a direct quote from the judge as reported by the Constitution on May the 2nd, 1909. "The man that fixed that door was either an unmitigated devil or an insane person." Here it is again from Judge Roan, the implication that there is the Will Mitchell everyone knew and this sort of darker, more deviant version of him hiding inside the same person. An unmitigated devil or an insane person. Really strong words. During the appeals process, the defense argued again that Mitchell was just temporarily insane that night. But the prosecution called attention to the premeditated nature of the crime, saying that going to such great lengths was, quote, positive proof of his sanity. Once again, a whole caravan of bigwigs from Thomasville came in for the appeals, all of them claiming that there is no way the William Mitchell they knew could commit such a heinous crime. Despite their best efforts, Mitchell lost the appeal, with multiple judges noting that 12 of his peers from his own county found him guilty and that it would be an insult to the rule of law to overturn their decision. But Mitchell's attorneys still were not done. Their Hail Mary was to ask for a pardon from either the prison commission or the governor himself. They lobbied vigorously to have his sentence to the chain gang reduced to a $500 fine. During the reporting of all this, a small paper out of Americus, Georgia, tracked down Lucille Linton, who'd since left Thomasville and taken up permanent residence in Athens. They asked her thoughts on this idea of reducing his penalty to a mere fine. This is what she had to say. "Will a fine, the mere payment of money, be any punishment to the gloved hand at my throat and the horrible gleam in my captor's eye? For the protection of the women of Georgia, I ask, should this sentence be commuted?" For the protection of the women of Georgia. This same sentiment was argued by a member of the prison commission. He said that Mitchell was, quote, a menace to the safety of Georgia women, end quote. Ultimately, the request for clemency was flatly denied. There wasn't a shred of doubt that William H. Mitchell committed the crimes he was accused of. And so finally, in September of 1909, Mitchell's sentence was carried out. His lawyers made the case that his physical condition prevented him from actually working on the chain gang, so he was sent to a prison medical facility to serve his time there. However, he wasn't there long. In July of 1910, Mitchell's hometown newspaper in Thomasville boomed the headline, W.H. Mitchell is released. In less than a year, William Mitchell was a free man. He was released early due to good behavior. The paper reported that Mitchell planned to return to Thomasville to his previous life as a farmer. Now, everything I just told you was fact. The details came from dozens of news articles. Newspapers all around the state of Georgia covered the Mitchell trial with intense interest. However, I'm sort of shifting gears here now from reporting the facts of a historical incident to proposing a theory, and I want to be clear about that. Like all theories, some evidence supports it and some does not. Ultimately, you get to decide. I'd like to make the case that William H. Mitchell was the Atlanta Ripper. Pretty crazy, I know, but I think there's lots of compelling evidence. You just heard the story. What do you think? Was William H. Mitchell some kind of highly intelligent, psychotic killer? Could this same man who abducted Lucille Linton have also preyed on women in Atlanta? And if so, do the timing and logistics line up to support this idea? What do you think? I have strong thoughts, and I want to lay out my case for the Mitchell theory. That'll be next time on CATLICK. CATLICK is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harmon. Original music and sound design by the amazing Luciel. Cover art by Rachel Eleanor. CATLICK store manager, Brett Harmon. CATLICK Instagram follower of the week, Greta High. CATLICK word of mouth superstar of the week, Amanda Cox. If you want to see for yourself the evidence against William H. Mitchell, you can do that at catlick.com. We've got tons of bonus material loaded up and waiting for you inside the vault. It's our Insider's exclusive digital scrapbook where you can see all the visuals that go along with every episode. We're talking photos, old maps, news clippings, and more. You can get instant access for about the price of a steamy romance novel. Woohoo! What are you waiting for? Start exploring at catlick.com, then click on Vault. Once again, that's catlick.com. If you've got thoughts or tips on the Mitchell theory, shoot us an email at themitchelltheory@gmail.com. themitchelltheory@gmail.com. And finally, CATLICK is independently written and produced by me, B.T. Harmon, signing off. I'd like to remind you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. We'll see you in the next episode.